Let's talk environmental phys. Environmental phys is going to envelop the concepts of altitude, heat, cold, even things like wind and humidity. It's everything outdoors that you might experience around the human as they work out and how it's going to affect the workout. So if you put yourself in a certain location, a workout might end up being very much different than another location. For example, if you've ever hiked up a mountain, particularly one in like Colorado that's getting up to 10,000 feet or 12,000 or 14,000 feet, whatever it is, you may have noticed it's much more difficult, right? Even at 5,000 feet altitude, it's going to be more difficult than sea level, or even here in Montreat at 3,000 feet. But we have these different effects based off our environment that we have to consider, both for a performance standpoint and as well as clinical standpoints, and from the standpoint of safety as well. So the first one's altitude. This is usually where people's mind goes when they talk about environmental phys, because I think it interests a lot of people. Basically, the idea is as you go higher and higher and higher up in elevation, there's a decrease in atmospheric pressure. What that means is the pressure that's being put on you by your environment has decreased. Now, this can be good or bad, right? You can move easier through a decreased pressure, right? You have less air resistance. But what you have instead is this decreased pressure shifting some of these slopes in our body. So what I mean by this is, if you think back to like the respiratory conversation we had, you breathe in. How do you breathe in? Well, you take your lungs, you open them up, and it creates this slope of pressure where the pressure outside your lungs is greater than the pressure inside your lungs. So then that oxygen is going to flow down that slope into your lungs, and then you can do something with it. And then once you want to exhale, your lungs compress, and when they compress, they add pressure, and that shoots the air right back out. So let's think about this from the altitude standpoint. If you take a big breath at altitude, and you decrease the pressure, and you're relying on the pressure in the atmosphere to push that air in, but now there's less pressure in the air, rather than having this big old slope, it's now a little bit more shallow. You can still bring air in, but it's harder. You just don't get as much air with each breath. And this is why a lot of people are going to have effects at altitude where they feel like they're out of breath. And we can adapt to this, we can get better at this, but regardless, it is a limiter of performance, and it is affecting people's health in both positive and negative ways. So let's go ahead and clear up one misconception. Something that you hear a lot of times is there's less oxygen up at altitude, and that's entirely wrong. The reality is way up on Mount Everest, you have roughly 22% of the air is oxygen, and down here at Montreat, roughly 22% is oxygen. Where I grew up in a very low lying area, 22% oxygen roughly. It's all the same, right? The only thing that's changing is this pressure and your ability to actually bring air down the slope. So there's terms that are going to come into play. Hypoxia is low pressure of oxygen, which is altitude. There's normoxia, which is normal pressure, which is sea level. And then there's hyperoxia. If you watch a football team, they go play the Denver Broncos, and you look on the sidelines, people are bringing in a lot of oxygen. They're wearing oxygen masks on the sidelines. They're bringing in a lot of oxygen. What's in that tube is a hyperoxia scenario, where either they're adding pressure of oxygen or they're just adding a greater percent of oxygen to the air. And this is going to create the ability to bring in more oxygen, so that once they go back on the field, they're less likely to become hypoxic. or have this oxygen decrease in concentration. So where we really started to consider the effects of altitude, while we were aware of them from people exploring or traveling throughout human history or going up mountains, they noticed that there was less oxygen. But where we really picked up on this was in 1960s during the Olympics. So 64 was in Tokyo, 68 was in Mexico City. And we look at sort of these winning times for the short races. In the 100-meter dash, they went from 10 seconds to 9.9, which doesn't sound like a lot of change, but that's about a 1% change. 200 went from 20.3 to 19.8, which is a 2.5% improvement. The 400, 45.1 to 43.8, almost a 3%. 800, about 0.8% improvement. So across the board, in these men's races, we have improvements. Similarly, if we look down at the women's races, we have improvements across the board, minus the 400, which was won in the same exact time. So people started scratching their head saying, why is it that in Mexico City, everyone's just running faster? Is it something about the track? Well, the track's the same surface. It's similar athletes, similar caliber. There hasn't been any major tech advances in these events or training changes in these events. So what is it? Well, it's probably the fact that Mexico City is at altitude. So they think about this farther and they realize, you know what? There's less air resistance. We're able to run through that air and we easier. So our sprint events are going quicker. Now in the long races, we have a change. Let's take our distance runs. 1500 was faster Mexico City. By chance, maybe tactics came into play. But every other event, we had a pretty major decrease in performance, where the 3K was taking longer, the 5K was taking much longer, 10K longer, marathon way longer, 6.2% slower, which is a huge deal in running. And then the 50K walk was 3.6% slower. And again, we're seeing probably this lack of oxygen was limiting their performance. So this begins to get studied farther and farther. We can even look at events like the long jump, where we had these big jumps in performance. Maybe it was the environment of everyone's doing so well, they're really succeeding, less so the altitude, but there is some improvement or some biomechanical advantage to altitude, but maybe not as much. But you had Bob Beamon famously jumped over 29 feet. I want to say 29 feet and 3 inches. If you can't picture that, that's almost like if you took a 3-story building, you toppled it over, he would jump from the floor to the top of the ceiling on the 3rd floor. 2 giraffes on top of each other. Giraffes are roughly 15 feet tall. 2 mid-sized sedans, he could jump right past them. This guy was jumping super, super far. So the idea was, okay, let's really consider this, and this is where we start to do research about environmental phys, and it develops as a field. So what we find from a maximal aerobic power standpoint, this is aerobic power, not anaerobic power, but you have your VO2 max is decreasing. So at 2,400 meters, it's 12% lower, but once you get up to like 4,000 meters, it's 27% lower. That's a huge deal, right? That's really going to limit the performance if people are capped out at the most oxygen they can deliver to the working muscle. They can't feed those bioenergetic systems, and they shut down. So what this is going to correlate to is roughly a 1% decrease in performance for every 100 meters and altitude past 1,400 meters. So we're looking at, roughly off the top of my head, we're looking at about 45 to 5,000 feet. Every 100 meters higher than that, you're going to have a pretty large chunk of performance decrease. At moderate altitudes, which is probably more high altitudes by our standards, approximately 4,000 meters, you're going to have a decreased VO2 max due to decreased arterial oxygen pressure. So actually within the arteries, we aren't able to create the pressure we need to actually unload this oxygen. And then at even higher elevations, VO2 max is reduced due to a fall in maximum cardiac output. We aren't able to get enough blood through, which is going to decrease the maximal heart rate at altitude. So to give a picture of this, if we take Mexico City at 7,400 feet, that's going to be a decrease of about 10%. You're only at 90% of the aerobic power. Leadville, Colorado, which is at 10,000 feet and hosts famous bike races and famous running ultramarathon races. We're at 80% in Peru. My wife lived way up in the Andes Mountains for a period of time. And when she lived there, she would probably have been experiencing about 70% of the maximal aerobic power that she would have at home in Indiana. So you're seeing these pretty drastic drops in performance with increased altitude. Changing the heart rate response at a VO2. So at a given VO2, the heart is having to work harder. So not only are you have the stress response essentially that's accelerating the heart rate as well. And then you have your ventilation response changed where you're just bringing in as much as you can. You're versus normal breathing, even at relatively low effort levels compared to sea level. So 21,000 feet, 19,000 feet. These are really, really some of the highest places on Earth. Colorado, some of the highest places in the U.S. is what we're seeing here. So if you've been to Colorado and you've worked out on a mountainside or hiked hard on a mountainside, think about that difference and then multiply it by this much, and you're talking what it's like to be at some of the truly highest places on the planet. Good news is, to at least some extent, we can adapt to altitude. Someone who lives there for a period of time, or even if you're just there for 10 days, you're going to start to have an adaptive response. This is done through more red blood cells, which is triggered by EPO, erythropoietin, a naturally formed chemical that's going to produce red blood cells. So that's a primary response. You're also going to see a greater oxygen saturation, so you're going to have an increased blood flow to the lungs through what's called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is why people take beetroot juice or take actually nitric oxide itself, but it's going to cause dilation. It's a gas that causes dilation of your arteries, so it's going to increase the blood flow to the lungs to actually pick up more blood. And then you're also going to see some interesting adaptations for someone born at altitude or the pregnancy of a child being at altitude, where if they are in the womb while at altitude, then they're going to come out with a higher or shifted lung structure as far as more alveoli, more ability to actually perfuse oxygen, which is something that you can't actually change after birth. You're just born with it. So this is an advantage someone would have if they were born at altitude, or at least were in the womb at altitude, I should say. Hypoxia, erythropoietin, red blood cell production happens in this way. You have less blood oxygen, which is picked up by the kidney. Kidney is what actually produces erythropoietin, which goes and triggers hemopoiesis within the red bone marrow, which is red blood cell production. And then you have more blood oxygen through this higher carrying capacity. This happens relatively quickly. The good news is for someone who lives at altitude or spends time at altitude, and then they go away, and then they come back, they're actually going to have a quicker and more efficient red blood cell response. So this process will happen easier with time. So you're going to see different people who, like everything else, kind of fall on a spectrum here, where some people are high altitude responders, some are low responders, and that's normal. Some people just don't do better at altitude. So you'll see some professional athletes go live in, Boulder, Colorado, Flagstaff, Arizona, Bend, Oregon, places like that are at high altitude. And some of those groups do really, really well and they adapt a ton. And then other people just don't see any adaptation. So they stop doing that and they stay living at sea level. And that's okay. What we will often see is these athletes are going to carry these benefits of being altitude to low altitude. So they go back to low altitude, they race, and they have that red blood cell production. They have a higher oxygen delivery ability, so that's going to increase their VO2 max at normoxia, normal altitude. Now, what you're going to see what the pros do more often than not is what's called live high, train low. So live high, train low is this concept that it's probably time spent at altitude that's triggering these responses, less so than exercising at altitude. So if you exercise at altitude, you're going to have a higher stress response. You aren't going to be able to work as hard. You're going to be limited in your performance, so your workouts might not go as well, at least aerobic ones. But if you live high, train low, then you're going to see where these people have good benefits. So what we have is we have these individuals. They'll spend 22 hours per day at a high altitude, or at least a simulated high altitude. So what they'll do is then they'll drive down. So say you're in Boulder, Colorado, where it's like 5,000 feet in the city, but you can go outside the city and hit like 10 to 14,000 feet. At least find homes at the 8, 9, 10,000 feet range. So what they'll do is they'll go live way up there, and then they'll drive into the city and do their workouts. Same thing with Flagstaff or Bend. They'll drive down into Eugene, Oregon kind of area, go down the mountain, do the workout, come back and live high. They spend the time, they put in the hours, and they have the adaptations. Way less common is live high or live low, train high. Not huge changes in VO2 max or hemoglobin concentrations, unfortunately. What they have instead is they don't have those prolonged altitude exposure effects, where altitude is going to cause a stress response. It could potentially be an issue. It could also potentially be healthy. But the main idea here is most of these professional athletes are choosing live high, train low. Heat is another one. So you might have heard of heat as poor man's altitude. And we'll see in a second that there are these like adaptations that happen with heat that sort of mimic being at altitude. So, but what we need to worry about is, sorry, my words are all messed up, but what we need to be worried about is there's heat illnesses are very, very common, right? You have these in elderly people, you have these in people who are just sitting outside or working in the garden, and you have them in athletes. So it's a big concern. So it kind of starts in this pattern. You have cramps first. You have heat syncope where your blood pressure drops out, you're dehydrated, blood's pooling in your ankles, you're dizzy. Heat exhaustion sets in next, which is going to cause your heart is just not going to be cutting it as far as meeting the cardiac demands. From there, you go all the way to heat stroke, which is going to cause brain damage, right? And this is a medical emergency. So with each of these, our goal here is to cool the person down, get them hydrated, and get them out of the heat. So, with this said, though, people can adjust to heat relatively well. Similar to altitude, it's a 10 to 14 day acclimatization period. Acclimatization is a term that's different than acclimation. Acclimation isn't a technical term in this regard. Acclimatization would be, as far as you're getting used to the climate that you're in. So you would start out with low intensity, long duration, spend time in heat. Then go to moderate intensity, short duration. And then some of these adaptations you're going to have is increased plasma volume, capacity to sweat, increased VO2 max, increased cardiac output, lactic threshold performance, lower body temperature, heart rate response, reduced sodium loss in sweat. Basically, you're sweating sooner in a workout and you're sweating more. And you're also building up your oxygen carrying capacity. Because if you think about going to a hot environment and you start to work out, what's the first thing that happens? Well, you start to sweat. How does sweat happen? It's because blood is going towards the skin. So if your blood's going to your skin, it's not going to your muscles anymore, so you have less oxygen carrying capacity. So you're going to see some of these VO2 max shifts where plasma volume's increasing, and you're improving performance, which is kind of nice because once you go to a cool environment, these performance effects last. It's not isolated to hot environments. And the best protection against heat stroke and exhaustion is this: a good acclimatization protocol. Get used to the heat, adapt to the heat, let your body do its thing, and then you'll be fine. What's a little bit harder to adapt to, though, is humidity. So humidity is obviously moisture in the air. So if you think about how, I'm going to skip around a little bit because I know it's here, but if you think about how you actually cool off, is you have blood flow to the skin, and then that water is along the skin, and then if the environment is dry, then that water is going to be sucked up into the air, right? But if it's humid, it's the same principle as any physics class you've taken, where you have a lot of water in one place and you have a lot of water in the other place. They aren't going anywhere. Water's going to go where it's dry. So if it's a dry environment, water goes off your skin. But if it's humid, it stays there. So you lose that ability to kind of get rid of your heat quite as easily. And we know this from different research studies that you aren't going to adapt as well either. So if we take two arms and I wrap one in saran wrap or plastic wrap, and I go exercise for a few weeks in a heat chamber, a dry heat chamber, and then I go do a test with my arm that was in plastic wrap and it's unwrapped now, it's normal, and then the other one that's been fine and normal the entire time. Well, guess what? This one is going to sweat and have adaptations and it's going to do better, whereas the one that was under plastic wrap and in a humid environment isn't. They were doing the same workout, same room, same temperature, everything. Only difference is one was more humid than the other, and you see less heat adaptations from the one that was humid. So humidity is kind of a problematic thing for humans. We aren't great at dealing with humidity. So things that are going to affect heat injury, things you need to consider if you're working in a hot environment with athletes or people of any kind. Get them acclimatized, make sure they're fit enough to handle what they're doing, because if they aren't fit enough and you add on hot temperatures, that's where you have big problems. Add on clothing that they can't get rid of that sweat, another problem. Why is it that every year it seems like some kid drops of a cardiac event during a football practice? Well, it's this. They weren't fit enough. They didn't have the right clothing. They were getting pushed too hard before they had acclimatized. Now they have all this cardiac output, and it's going to cause stresses on their heart that they aren't prepared for. So heat injury happens when fitness isn't there, clothing isn't considered, and they aren't acclimatized to the environment, particularly when it's humid. Hypothermia is the other direction. If it's cold, obviously you want to keep them warm and you want to keep them dry. Being wet in the cold is a huge deal. That's very, very problematic. So you want to make sure that they're dry, insulated as much as possible, and also understand that performance in extreme hypothermia is going to decrease. If it's really cold outside, people's muscles aren't going to work as well, and performance is going to decline as well. But for the most part, we think of hypothermia from the standpoint of keep them dry, keep them out of the wind, and layer with materials that aren't going to absorb water as easily. More athletic materials, less cotton if possible. So probably not as big of a deal here in the South, but at least where I came from, I lived in a place and trained in a place where it was snow drifts a couple feet deep through all winter long, negative 50 degrees outside occasionally, and we ran all winter. And so this was a big deal. Cover the skin. Don't let the wind get you, because the wind will give people frostbite quicker than just normal air will. So dry, layered, avoid the wind as much as possible. All right, so some environmental factors here. We've talked about wind chill. In case you don't know, temperature. So let's say it's 0 degrees outside and there's no wind. You'll survive. You can handle it. You can exercise in it. It's not ideal, obviously, but at least aerobic sports are going to be fine if they aren't standing around and they're layered properly. Problem, though, is if you add in wind, let's say it's 30 mile per hour wind at 0 degrees, and all of a sudden you're getting frostbite at 30 minutes in, which you might not get through an exercise. I've been in probably this range for air temperature. You add in winds, and we were getting into this realm right here pretty easily, about probably 2 or 3 times in the 3 years that I lived there. And this was like 5 minutes you get frostbite, where your skin actually freezes. So this is a more dangerous environment. Really try to avoid any of these colored regions here. You want to keep people, they'll be fine in this sort of weather here, where it's calm and 15, 10, 5 degrees, especially if they get a proper warm up and they stay warm and they're logical about how they do things. Air quality index. Hear this all the time. A wildfire happens. People are told to stay inside. You go to a city and it's a bad pollution day. People are told to get inside. The reality is there's health alerts here where it can actually damage your lungs. Another factor is poor air quality is going to affect performance as well. All right. So that is it for what I had in slides. One thing to add with heat acclimatization, one of the popular things right now is adding dry saunas. So if someone's going to go be in a sauna, they will, or be in a hot area, they'll jump into a heat sauna. But we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more in the next video.